Why would any person spend $7 million on a house destined to be used for merely 6 weeks? Not as a financial investment, not as a rental property, not even as a full-time residence, just 6 weeks, every summer, after which the doors are locked and 58 servants remain behind to tend an empty palace through the winter. This inquiry isn't about money at all. The Vanderbilts possessed far more than they could possibly spend. Cornelius II could have constructed 10 houses of this magnitude and scarcely noticed the expense. The cost simply didn't matter. So the question lingers, why build the breakers at all? The answer reveals a world that has completely vanished. A world where wealth held no meaning unless everyone could witness it. Where constructing a summer cottage larger than European palaces wasn't madness, but rather strategy. Where families exhausted fortunes attempting to destroy one another socially, and architecture became their weapon of choice. Cornelius Vanderbilt II completed the breakers in 1895. 70 rooms, Italian Renaissance design, imported marble, bronze, and craftsmen brought from across the ocean. He enjoyed one summer there in good health before a stroke left him partially paralyzed. He died at 55. His widow spent the subsequent 35 years struggling to prevent the house from bankrupting what remained of the family. The breakers still stands today. You can walk through it for $29. But nothing like it will ever be built again. This is the story of why these houses were constructed, why construction stopped, and why the conditions that created them disappeared so completely that even today's wealthiest individuals cannot recreate them. Before any social battles could commence, the ammunition had to exist. And the wealth behind the breakers came from something that didn't exist either. For 41 years, from 1872 until 1913, the United States federal government collected no income tax from its citizens. None whatsoever. The wealthy kept everything they earned. This wasn't an oversight. The Constitution originally prohibited direct federal taxation without apportioning it among the states by population. Congress had imposed an income tax during the Civil War to fund the Union Army, but that measure expired in 1872. When lawmakers attempted to revive it in 1894, the Supreme Court struck down the law as unconstitutional. The Vanderbilts built their empire within this void. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, died in January 1877. He had started with nothing, just a ferryboat borrowed from his mother. By his death at 82, he controlled a transportation network spanning the eastern seaboard. Steamships first, then railroads. The New York Central line alone generated enormous sums annually. His estate totaled approximately $100 million. To understand what that figure meant, consider this: the United States Treasury held less in gold reserves. One individual possessed more liquid wealth than the federal government. No inheritance tax reduced what passed to his heirs. No estate duty claimed a percentage for public coffers. The Commodore left nearly everything to his eldest surviving son, William Henry. Conventional wisdom suggested this was a mistake. William had spent decades farming on Staten Island while his father built the railroad empire. Critics assumed he lacked the ability to manage such holdings. They were wrong. William Henry Vanderbilt proved more capable than anyone expected. He expanded the railroad network, negotiated favorable agreements with competitors, and managed costs with precision his father never attempted. 8 years later, he had doubled the inheritance. When William died suddenly in December 1885, his estate exceeded $200 million. That sum staggers even by modern standards. Converted to present value, it approaches $6 billion. But the comparison understates the reality. The entire federal budget for 1885 was approximately $260 million. William Henry Vanderbilt's personal holdings nearly equaled what the government spent running the country for an entire year. He divided it among his 8 children. The eldest son, Cornelius II, received the largest share. Approximately $70 million passed to him directly, along with control of the family's railroad interests. His younger brother, William Kissam, received a similar inheritance. The youngest son, George Washington Vanderbilt, received roughly $10 million outright plus substantial trust income. Each brother could spend freely without consequence, build a palace on Fifth Avenue, construct a summer cottage in Newport, commission a country estate in the Carolina mountains. The money regenerated faster than they could deploy it. Railroad dividends arrived quarterly. Real estate holdings appreciated annually. Interest compounded on investments they never touched. No government entity claimed a portion. No progressive taxation scaled with their income. No alternative minimum ensured they paid something. The Vanderbilt brothers existed in a financial environment that modern wealth cannot replicate. When Cornelius II decided to rebuild the breakers after a fire destroyed the original wooden structure in 1892, the project budget reached $7 million. This represented roughly 10% of his liquid assets, a significant commitment certainly, but the holdings would replenish themselves within a few years through ordinary investment returns. He never questioned whether he could afford it. The question was meaningless. Without income tax, without estate tax, without serious constraint on accumulated capital, a man worth $70 million could build anything he imagined. The Vanderbilts were not unique. The Astors held comparable holdings in Manhattan real estate. The Rockefellers controlled oil. The Carnegies dominated steel. The Morgans directed finance. Each family operated under the same tax regime, which is to say no regime at all. They competed with each other not just in business, but in building. Whoever constructed the largest house, threw the most elaborate party, displayed the most obvious prosperity, won a social victory that money alone could not purchase. This competition would produce extraordinary private residences across American soil. It would also contain the seeds of its own destruction. The same concentration of capital that funded these palaces eventually provoked a political response. But through the 1880s and 1890s, that response remained decades away. For now, the money flowed without interruption, and the building continued. The money alone meant nothing. Here was the central problem facing every newly wealthy family in Gilded Age America. You could build a railroad empire, corner the steel market, or monopolize oil production. You could accumulate more wealth than European royalty. But unless the right people acknowledged your existence, you remained invisible. Your daughters could not marry well. Your sons could not join the best clubs. Your name appeared nowhere that mattered. The right people meant one person above all, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Mrs. Astor, as she insisted on being called, controlled access to New York society through sheer force of will. Her husband showed little interest in social climbing. She showed nothing else. From her brownstone mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue, she decided who belonged and who did not. Her ballroom held approximately 400 guests. According to her ally, Ward McAllister, the number was not a limitation but a definition. Only 400 people in New York truly mattered. If you went beyond that number, McAllister explained, you would find people who either felt uncomfortable at a ball or made others uncomfortable. The list that emerged from this arrangement became known simply as the 400. McAllister coined the phrase. Mrs. Astor enforced it. For decades, an invitation to her annual ball served as the only reliable confirmation that you had arrived socially. Without that invitation, your millions bought nothing but expensive loneliness. The Vanderbilts had millions. They did not have an invitation. Mrs. Astor considered the family irredeemably common. The Commodore had been a ferryman. He swore constantly, spat tobacco, and conducted business with a brutality that offended genteel sensibilities. His descendants inherited his fortune, but not his manners. Mrs. Astor refused to call on them, which in the elaborate etiquette of the era meant she refused to acknowledge they existed. She would not visit their homes. She would not receive them in hers. She would not invite them anywhere. Alva Smith Vanderbilt decided to change this. Alva had married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875, gaining access to one of America's largest fortunes. But money without social position was merely wealth. Alva wanted power. She understood that breaking into society required a weapon, and she chose the most expensive one available, architecture. In 1882, William completed a mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue that occupied an entire city block. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt in the style of a French chateau, it announced the Vanderbilts' arrival in a language even Mrs. Astor could not ignore. The building itself was an argument. If we can construct this, it declared, we belong here. Alva then planned a housewarming ball for March 1883 that would surpass anything New York had witnessed. She invited journalists to preview the decorations. She let rumors circulate about the costumes, the flowers, the entertainment. Young society women began rehearsing quadrilles in anticipation. The entire city buzzed with talk of the upcoming event. One person received no invitation, Carrie Astor, the daughter of Mrs. Astor herself. The reason was exquisitely simple. Alva explained that since Mrs. Astor had never called on the Vanderbilt home, she had no address to which she could send an invitation. A perfect trap wrapped in perfect manners. Mrs. Astor could maintain her snub and watch her daughter excluded from the social event of the decade, where she could relent. Carrie had been practicing her quadrille for weeks with friends who all received their invitations. She begged her mother to do something. Mrs. Astor, recognizing defeat, ordered her carriage to 665th Avenue. She left her calling card. The next day, the Astors received their invitation. On March 26, 1,200 guests in elaborate costumes filled the Vanderbilt mansion. Mrs. Astor attended dressed as a Venetian princess. Her presence confirmed what everyone already understood: the Vanderbilts had won. They would subsequently receive invitations to the Astor Ball. They had entered the 400. But Alva's victory came with a complication. That same evening, her sister-in-law, Alice, arrived dressed as the Electric Light. Her gown, created by Charles Frederick Worth, glittered with hundreds of diamonds arranged to suggest illumination. Alice outshone everyone in the room, including the hostess. The rivalry between the two women would intensify for years. It would eventually shape the mansions of Newport. The game worked exactly like this. Every triumph created new enemies. Every ally expected reciprocation. Building a house larger than your neighbors established dominance, but it also demanded a response. The competition fed on itself, escalating until the structures became almost absurdly grand. Newport, Rhode Island, became the ultimate arena for these battles. The summer season there lasted 6 to 8 weeks, from early July through late August. Yet families spent millions constructing cottages they would occupy for less than 2 months annually. The compressed time frame intensified everything. All the dinners, balls, and garden parties that might spread across a year in other cities concentrated into a single explosive summer. Reputations rose and fell between June and September. The Vanderbilt brothers understood this perfectly. When William Kissam built Marble House in Newport for Alva, his brother Cornelius responded by rebuilding the breakers on an even grander scale. When one family hosted a dinner for 200, another hosted a dinner for 300. The houses grew larger, the parties more elaborate, the competition more vicious. None of it made rational sense. These were vacation homes used a few weeks per year, maintained by armies of servants through empty winters, draining fortunes that could have funded more productive investments. But rationality missed the point entirely. The mansions were not really about shelter. They were about winning. And winning required building something your rivals could not match. Winning required more than money. It required knowing what to build. The Vanderbilts and their rivals faced a peculiar challenge. They wanted homes that would impress European aristocrats. But America offered no architectural tradition for such structures. Nobody knew how to build a palace. Richard Morris Hunt solved this problem. He had trained where the answers existed. In 1846, at age 19, Hunt became the first American admitted to the architecture program at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He studied under French masters, worked on the expansion of the Louvre, and spent years sketching palazzos, chateaux, and cathedrals across the continent. He returned in 1855, carrying expertise no compatriot possessed. Hunt understood that American millionaires did not merely want large houses. They wanted legitimacy, structures that announced their place among the aristocracy of the world. European nobles inherited castles built by ancestors over centuries. Americans would have to manufacture that heritage from scratch. The solution was architectural translation. Take the finest European designs and build them with materials and craftsmanship that exceeded the originals. For Marble House, Hunt drew on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. But where the original used modest amounts of stone, Marble House consumed 500,000 cubic feet of marble imported from Africa and Italy. The entrance doors alone weighed more than a ton each and cost $50,000 per door. For the breakers, Hunt turned to the Palazzi di Genova, documenting the 16th century palaces of Italian merchant princes, families who had grown wealthy through trade rather than inheritance, self-made men building monuments to their own success. The Vanderbilts would do the same. Hunt assembled an international team. Artisans fabricated entire rooms in European workshops, disassembled them for the Atlantic crossing, and reconstructed them in Newport. The music room at the breakers was built complete in France, then installed piece by craftsmen brought over specifically for the task. These men represented traditions stretching back centuries. Stone carvers learned their trade through apprenticeships lasting 7 years or more. Gilders practiced techniques passed from master to student across generations. Decorative plasterers created ornamental details that machines could not replicate. European guild systems had preserved these skills. America had nothing comparable. So Hunt imported what he needed. For a brief window of perhaps 40 years, the wealth of American industrialists intersected with the skills of European craftsmen to produce structures unlike anything built before or since. Visitors to the breakers entered a great hall 50 feet high, walls lined with carved limestone and rare stone from 3 continents. Gold leaf covered surfaces throughout both mansions, applied by hand in sheets thinner than paper. Every detail, from door hinges to light fixtures, received the attention once reserved for cathedrals and royal palaces. Hunt died in July 1895, 3 weeks before the breakers hosted its first major party. He never saw his greatest achievement in full celebration. The structures he designed outlasted everything else from that era. The fortunes dissipated, the family scattered. The craftsmen passed their skills to fewer and fewer successors until the trades nearly vanished. What remains are the buildings themselves, monuments to a moment when unlimited money met irreplaceable skill. The palaces needed people to run them. 58 servants operated the breakers. 33 worked indoors as maids, cooks, footmen, and butlers. 25 labored outside as gardeners and groundskeepers. All for a family who visited 6 to 8 weeks per year. Finding them proved difficult. A phrase circulated through Gilded Age society pages, the servant problem. Mark Twain captured the reason: whenever a man preferred being fed by another man to starving in independence, he ought to be shot. Most Americans agreed. They had crossed oceans to escape hereditary class systems, not to recreate them. So the great houses drew staff almost entirely from recent arrivals. Irish women dominated the lower ranks. German and Scandinavian immigrants filled specialized roles. English servants commanded premium wages because they understood the rituals American families wanted to imitate. A butler trained in a London household could name his price. Rigid hierarchy governed these staffs. At the top stood the butler, managing male servants and controlling access to wine and silver. The housekeeper supervised females. Below them, cook, lady's maid, valet, footmen, housemaids, kitchen maids, laundresses. Each position carried specific duties and status. A parlor maid outranked a chambermaid. Wages reflected these distinctions. A head butler earned $40 monthly. A housemaid received $18 to $25. A scullery maid collected $15 plus room, board, and uniform. For immigrants with nothing, this meant security. The cost was invisibility. At the breakers, staff bedrooms filled 2 concealed floors beneath the pitched roof. Narrow back staircases let maids move between levels without crossing paths with the family. Underground passages connected the kitchen wing to the main house. Food traveled. Cooks did not appear. Family rooms faced the ocean. Servant quarters faced interior courtyards or nothing at all. Work days had no limit. A housemaid rose before the family woke and worked until they retired. 16 hours was common. Days off depended on employer generosity. Female servants could not marry and keep their positions. No servant could speak unless spoken to. In some households, staff were forbidden from making eye contact. They existed to perform functions, not to be acknowledged. The arrangement suited everyone temporarily. Wealthy families got their houses run. Immigrants got stability. Fresh arrivals kept stepping off boats at Ellis Island, willing to trade years of service for a foothold in America. But nothing about it was permanent. The servants were climbing, not settling. Their children would refuse the bargain. And when willing workers stopped arriving, the great houses would face a problem money could not solve. The fire that destroyed the original breakers in November 1892 should have been a disaster. For Cornelius Vanderbilt II, it was an opportunity. His younger brother, William, had just unveiled Marble House down the road, $11,500,000 cubic feet of marble, the most opulent summer cottage Newport had ever seen. Cornelius, the head of the Vanderbilt family, now owned a pile of charred wood on the same stretch of coastline. He would build something larger. Cornelius hired Richard Morris Hunt within weeks of the fire. The architect produced preliminary designs in 6 weeks. They settled on a 70-room palazzo inspired by the merchant palaces of Renaissance Italy. Construction began in spring 1893 with a deadline that seemed impossible, completion before summer 1895. 2,000 workers labored in shifts around the clock to meet that schedule. They built the structure from steel and stone rather than wood, eliminating the fire risk that had destroyed the original. The boilers that heated the house sat underground, separated from the main building by a tunnel, so that even a catastrophic explosion could not reach the living quarters. Every precaution money could buy. The house was ready in time. Cornelius and his wife Alice hosted their first full summer there in 1895. He was 51 years old, president of the New York Central Railroad, head of the wealthiest family in America. The breakers announced his supremacy over his brother, over Newport, over anyone who might question his position. He got one summer in that condition. In 1896, Cornelius suffered a massive stroke. It left him partially paralyzed, confined largely to a wheelchair. He spent the next 3 years watching his health decline, unable to manage the railroad empire that had defined his life. He died in September 1899 at 55. Alice was 49. She would live another 35 years. The house Cornelius built to demonstrate his power became her burden. He left her a $7 million trust fund generating $250,000 annually. It sounded like an enormous sum. It was barely enough. Property taxes on the breakers rose steadily through the early 20th century, reaching $83,000 per year by the mid-1920s. The staff required to maintain an empty mansion consumed more. Alice also had to support the family's Manhattan residence, where taxes reached $130,000 annually. Together, the two houses devoured nearly all her income. She began alternating years, one summer in Newport, the next summer abroad while the breakers sat closed. Even a Vanderbilt could not afford to maintain both properties simultaneously. In 1926, Alice sold the Manhattan mansion for $7 million. Developers demolished it the following year. She retreated to a smaller apartment on Fifth Avenue, keeping only the breakers as her summer residence. She died in 1934 at 88, having outlived her husband by 35 years and most of her children. The house that Cornelius built to surpass his brother survived everything except the world that created it. Marble House announced Alva Vanderbilt's supremacy over Newport society. In 1895, it served a different purpose. It became a prison. Her 18-year-old daughter, Consuelo, had committed an unforgivable act. She had fallen in love with the wrong man. Winthrop Rutherford came from impeccable American stock. His ancestors included Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He belonged to the 400. He was handsome, charming, and genuinely devoted to Consuelo. He was not a duke. Alva had recently divorced her husband, William, after years of his infidelity. Divorce was social death for a woman in that era, even a Vanderbilt. She needed something spectacular to restore her position. Her daughter marrying into the highest ranks of British aristocracy would accomplish what no amount of money could buy. She had already selected the groom, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He had inherited Blenheim Palace and the crushing debts that came with it. He needed American money. Alva needed a title. The transaction made perfect sense to everyone except the bride. When Consuelo confessed her secret engagement to Rutherford that summer, Alva exploded. She slandered him as a fortune hunter, claimed his family carried hereditary madness, forbade all contact. Consuelo stood firm. She loved him. She intended to marry him. Alva issued her final warning: if Consuelo tried to elope, Alva would shoot Rutherford dead. She confined her daughter to the house. No visitors, no correspondence, no escape. The marble walls that impressed Newport society became the barriers of Consuelo's captivity. Still, the girl refused. Then Alva collapsed. She took to her bed. A doctor pronounced her heart dangerously weak. He warned that further resistance from Consuelo might prove fatal. Watching her mother apparently dying, Consuelo finally surrendered. Alva recovered immediately. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church in Manhattan. Consuelo spent the morning weeping alone in her room, a footman posted at the door. Her face was so swollen from crying that the ceremony started 20 minutes late, waiting for the evidence to subside enough to hide behind her veil. She walked down the aisle to marry a man she did not love in exchange for a title her mother wanted. The Duke collected $2.5 million in railroad stock. On their honeymoon, he informed Consuelo that he had married her only because he felt obligated to save Blenheim. He despised anything that was not British. They separated in 1906, divorced in 1921. 3 decades after the wedding, when Consuelo sought an annulment from the Catholic Church, Alva provided testimony. She stated plainly what everyone already knew: I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter. By then, Alva had reinvented herself as a champion of women's rights. She served as president of the National Women's Party. She marched for suffrage. She advocated for female independence and autonomy. The woman who had locked her daughter in a marble prison to force an unwanted marriage spent her final years fighting for women's freedom to control their own lives. She never acknowledged the contradiction. Peter Widener started as a butcher's apprentice in Philadelphia. He made his first fortune supplying mutton to Union troops during the Civil War. He invested in streetcars, then steel, then Standard Oil. By the 1890s, he ranked among the richest men in America. In 1897, he commissioned Horace Trumbauer to design a house that would hold his family and his art collection under one roof. The result was Lynnewood Hall. 110 rooms, 55 bedrooms, a ballroom for 1,000 guests. Paintings by Raphael, Rembrandt, Donatello, Van Dyck, and El Greco lined the walls of a private gallery that rivaled any museum in America. The estate covered 300 acres outside Philadelphia. It had its own power plant, its own farm, its own water system. 100 servants kept everything running. Widener piped hot air from the farm buildings to the main house so no furnace fire could threaten his paintings. His grandson later called it the last American Versailles. In 1912, Widener's eldest son, George, and grandson, Harry, boarded the Titanic for the voyage home from Europe. Neither survived. A wedding planned at Lynnewood Hall for Harry's sister became a quiet ceremony instead. Peter Widener died 3 years later. His surviving son, Joseph, inherited the house, the art, and a fortune of $60 million. Joseph continued opening the gallery to the public several months each year, sharing the collection his father had spent decades assembling. Then came the forces that would destroy it all: income tax, inheritance tax, property tax, the costs of maintaining a 100-room mansion with 100 servants while the government claimed an ever larger share of every dollar. In 1940, Joseph's son wrote in his autobiography that the days of America's privately owned treasure houses were over. He was not being dramatic. He was being accurate. In 1942, Joseph donated the art collection to the National Gallery in Washington. He kept Lynnewood Hall, but the walls hung empty. He died the following year. In 1944, the remaining contents were auctioned. Life magazine covered the sale. The family offered the house itself but found no buyers. No one in the family wanted it. The estate that had once employed 100 people sold in 1952 for $192,000 to a religious seminary. The seminary could not afford the upkeep either. Over the following decades, they stripped and sold the interiors piece by piece: mantels, paneling, fixtures, anything that could be removed and converted to cash. By the 1990s, the building sat abandoned. Vandals and weather did what the seminary had not finished. The last American Versailles rotted behind its iron gates for 30 years. In 2023, a preservation foundation purchased it for $9 million. They estimate $50 million more will be needed to restore what remains. Peter Widener's great-grandchildren could not give away what he spent a lifetime building. On February 3, 1913, the 16th Amendment became law. Congress could now tax income directly. The first rate seemed modest, 1% on earnings above $3,000, a top rate of 7% on incomes exceeding $500,000. Fewer than 1% of Americans owed anything at all. Then came the war. By 1917, the top rate had climbed to 67%. By 1918, 77% on income above $1 million. A man who earned $500,000 in 1910 kept nearly all of it. The same income in 1918 left him with barely a quarter after federal taxes alone. The rates dropped after the armistice but never returned to pre-war levels. Estate taxes arrived in 1916, claiming a share of wealth at death. By 1941, the top estate rate reached 77%. A fortune that had passed intact from Commodore Vanderbilt to his son to his grandsons would now lose 3/4 of its value with each generation. Meanwhile, the servant class that made these houses functional was disappearing. The war had opened factory jobs that paid better than domestic service and came without the uniform, the hierarchy, the perpetual invisibility. Women who might have scrubbed floors in Newport discovered they could rivet airplane parts in Connecticut for twice the money and go home at the end of the shift. Immigration restrictions accelerated the collapse. The Acts of 1921 and 1924 slashed the flow of newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe to a fraction of pre-war levels. The pipeline that had supplied Irish housemaids and German cooks for half a century slowed to a trickle. The children of immigrants refused to follow their parents into service. They had not crossed an ocean to bow and scrape for another generation. They wanted careers, not positions. Independence, not livery. By 1940, the ratio of servants to households had fallen 36% from 1900. The houses had not gotten smaller. The families had not learned to cook. The work still existed, but the people willing to do it had found better options. No vacuum cleaner could replace a staff of 58. No dishwasher could substitute for a kitchen brigade. The technology that promised to liberate households from servants could handle a suburban home. It could not operate a 70-room palazzo designed around human labor at every turn. The Gilded Age mansion had been built on 3 assumptions: unlimited wealth, untaxed income, unlimited servants willing to dedicate their lives to someone else's comfort. By 1940, all 3 had vanished. 1926 was the year Fifth Avenue died. In that single year, the wrecking balls came for 3 of the grandest houses in American history: the Cornelius Vanderbilt Mansion at 57th Street, William K. Vanderbilt's Petit Chateau at 52nd, Mrs. Astor's Palace at 65th, the house where the 400 had been invented and enforced for 3 decades. All 3 had stood for roughly 40 years. All 3 fell within months of each other. The developers who bought these properties did not want the buildings. They wanted the land beneath them. Cornelius Vanderbilt's widow received $7 million for her mansion. The buyers intended to demolish it before the check cleared. In its place rose Bergdorf Goodman, a department store. The Petit Chateau became 666 Fifth Avenue, an office tower. Mrs. Astor's ballroom, where social standing had been granted or destroyed with a single invitation, became Temple Emmanuel. A week before the wreckers arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion, Alice opened it to the public for 50 cents admission. The money went to charity. Thousands came to see how the other half had lived. Then the house came down. The pattern repeated across Manhattan throughout the 1920s and 30s. The Fisk Mansion, the Brokaw House, the Clark Palace with its 121 rooms and 31 bathrooms fitted with gold fixtures. William Andrews Clark had spent $7 million building it in 1911. 16 years later, no buyer could be found. The maintenance costs exceeded what anyone would pay. It was demolished in 1927. The economics had inverted completely. These houses had been built to display wealth. Now they destroyed it. The land appreciated while the structures depreciated. Keeping a mansion meant losing money every year while neighbors sold to developers and walked away rich. By 1950, fewer than a dozen of the original Gilded Age mansions remained on Fifth Avenue. Where 100 palaces had once stood, glass towers and department stores rose in their place. A few survived by becoming something other than homes. The Frick Mansion at 70th Street became a museum in 1935. Andrew Carnegie's house became the Cooper Hewitt. The Metropolitan Club still stands because it was never a private residence. The houses that remained private did not last. The families could not afford them. The buyers did not want them. The land underneath was worth more empty than occupied. The Gilded Age had built monuments to permanence. The 20th century proved how temporary they actually were. Today's billionaires are richer than the Vanderbilts ever were. Adjusted for inflation, John D. Rockefeller's fortune peaked around $340 billion. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have both exceeded that number. They could afford to build houses that would make the breakers look modest. They choose not to. The change is not about money. It is about visibility. The Gilded Age treated wealth as something to display. The entire point of a mansion was to be seen. Cornelius Vanderbilt hired 600 artisans to work day and night expanding his Fifth Avenue palace specifically so his neighbors would notice. When Alva Vanderbilt threw her 1883 ball, she wanted 1,200 people to witness her arrival. Modern billionaires want the opposite. Their architects talk about privacy, security, and seclusion. Mark Zuckerberg's compound in Palo Alto consists of 5 separate houses arranged around a central courtyard where no one can see in. The priorities have inverted completely. Some have abandoned the idea of a single grand residence altogether. Larry Ellison, co-founder of Oracle, spent $300 million in 2012 to purchase 98% of an entire Hawaiian island. Lanai has 3,000 residents. Ellison became their landlord, their employer, or both. He did not build a palace. He bought a kingdom. When you can own an island, a mansion seems small. But even if a modern billionaire wanted to recreate the breakers, they could not. The craftsmen who built these houses no longer exist. The breakers required stonemasons who had trained for decades in techniques passed down through European guild systems. It needed wood carvers who could execute a specific Louis XIV style from memory. It demanded plasterers who knew how to apply gold leaf in patterns that took years to master. Those skills died with the men who held them. No training program produces them anymore. No immigration pipeline delivers them. The knowledge itself has been lost. Technology cannot replace what has vanished. A 3D printer cannot carve marble the way a Florentine sculptor did. Computer-controlled machines cannot replicate the irregular beauty of handwork. The imperfections were the point. They proved human hands had touched every surface. The economics have also shifted permanently. In 1895, wealthy Americans paid no income tax. They could direct every dollar toward construction. Today, before a billionaire spends a single dollar on marble, the government takes nearly 40%. The servant class that made these houses functional has disappeared entirely. No amount of money can hire 58 people willing to work as domestic staff in a private home. And there is a final reason no one will build them again. The houses themselves became targets. Visibility creates vulnerability. In an age of social media and constant surveillance, a grand house on Fifth Avenue would attract protesters, photographers, and worse. The families who built these palaces assumed their wealth would protect them. Their great-grandchildren know that their wealth makes them targets instead. So the billionaires of today retreat to private islands and gated compounds. They build walls instead of ballrooms. They hire security teams instead of butlers. The Gilded Age mansion required a world that no longer exists: untaxed income, unlimited servants, skilled craftsmen by the thousands, and a society that admired rather than resented the display of wealth. All four conditions vanished within a single generation. None will return. The Breakers still stands on its cliff above the Atlantic. The ocean view from the loggia remains unchanged since Cornelius Vanderbilt II first saw it in 1895. Nearly 500,000 tourists walk through those rooms each year. They pay admission to see what American wealth once looked like, when men could spend $7 million on a summer house and never worry about the bill. The guides explain who built it, who lived in it, who lost it. The visitors take photographs of marble and gilt and imported woodwork, then return to their cars and drive away. What they cannot photograph is the world that made the Breakers possible. That world required a nation without income tax, a servant class willing to sacrifice their lives for wages, and craftsmen trained in medieval techniques passed down through centuries. It required an America where display was the point, where rivals measured success by the height of their ballroom ceilings, where a man would build a palace knowing he might use it 6 weeks per year. That America lasted roughly 40 years, from the 1870s until the First World War. The conditions aligned. Before that period, the fortunes did not exist. After it, the taxes did. The Breakers survives because Gladys Vanderbilt II made a deal with the Preservation Society, $1 per year for access, enough admission revenue to keep the roof from leaking. Her mother, Alice, would have considered opening the house to strangers unthinkable. But Alice died in 1934, still believing that great families could outlast great changes. The tourists filing through those rooms are walking through a museum of a civilization, not just a house, but a theory of how wealth should be expressed. That theory held that the rich should announce themselves, that palaces proved legitimacy, that European grandeur could be purchased and shipped across the Atlantic. The men who built these houses believed they were founding dynasties. They were only building ruins.